Morning, everybody. I'm going to be talking about vehicle scrappage programs where India is dealing with a vehicle scrappage policy. Ours is a shorter term program, or was, but it led to a lot of very positive things, and that's what I kind of want to walk through. Um, just as way of background, as Hayden said, we're a national association of auto recyclers. I have 7 provincial regional associations, and they represent 350 direct members. So those are actual working auto recyclers buying end-of-life vehicles, selling parts and materials in virtually all corners of populated Canada. And we were organized in 1997, so not as long as ARA, our colleagues to the south, but in it for a while. And all of our members are audited to the Canadian Auto Recyclers Environmental Code, or CARIC. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because it was one of the things that fell out of our vehicle scrappage initiative. And that auditing by a third party is what defines us as being different than the other 1,000 or so auto recyclers, auto wreckers, scrap yards, junk yards that do exist in Canada. In terms of an industry overview, there are about 1.6 million end-of-life vehicles per year generated in Canada. That is an interpreted number because we don't have a great end-of-life certificate of destruction system to actually count. But year over year, it's that 5 to 6% of the fleet is retired. As with the USA, a very vibrant parts reuse marketplace exists and a material recovery sector. So that's primarily what my members are about, is reusing parts first, and those materials that are left on the hulk or the specialty materials are of value and add to the bottom line, but they are highly integrated with the supply chain on making sure that those vehicles are processed properly. The legislation and licensing that does exist in the industry tends to be provincial, so it's regional, not on a national basis. There are very few actual national requirements or policies, something that we're trying to change. So the vehicle itself is registered at a provincial level, and all of the major environmental rules exist at that provincial level. And that's why we have set up these provincial associations to kind of deal with those local issues. So I run the Ontario Association, which is the largest province in Canada, about 45% of the population, and tends to be the largest and most progressive of the auto recyclers. Traditionally, those provinces have had what we would call a historical salvage license, many of them coming from the 1970s, and they tended to be more with where are you situated in the city or the region from a zoning perspective, and somewhat minimal standards or enforcement against the environmental rules that do exist and are applied against all businesses. But much has changed since that Canada's National Scrappage Program. And I'll get into the whys and the hows, but we're certainly not where we need to be to have a fully functioning circular economy market going on. So to the National Vehicle Scrappage Program, it was launched in 2008 and ended in 2011. So it was a 3-year window that the government essentially intervened in the marketplace to drive some positive changes. It was introduced as an emissions reduction program, not as a stimulus program, not as a circular economy. So it was targeting 1995 or older vehicles. So again, we have to go back to 2008. And so those were roughly 13-year-old vehicles and older. And it was the 1995 vehicles that had the different emissions technology on them. And so that's what they were targeting. They offered a $300 cash incentive. And if I did my math right, I think that's 18,000 Indian rupees. So not a lot of money. At that time, the $300 was worth more than what your average scrap car coming off the road was, but it wasn't a dramatic amount. The automakers themselves added on their own incentive, roughly $500 to $1,000. If you went in and bought a new vehicle, then you got the $300 incentive from the government, but they topped it up with more money to try and drive people to purchase their vehicles. And if you note the dates, 2008, the great global financial crisis that happened, and how the auto sales dropped off. So they tacked on to the emissions program, and we're really starting to drive people getting in the door and buying new vehicles. Excuse me, new vehicles. The program itself, they had allocated $93 million Canadian to run the program. They ended up only spending about 75 of that. And not all of it was for the cash incentive. And I should add that they also offered transit passes, bike incentives, different things that weren't straight cash oriented to try and help you buy a new vehicle. So they were really interested in active transportation. All told, they retired about 120,000 vehicles over that 3-year period. So again, in relation to that 1.6 million vehicles coming off the road every year, it wasn't a huge dramatic insertion into the industry. The government engaged an environmental organization called the Clean Air Foundation to kind of manage this on a national basis. And they ended up branding the program as Retired Your Ride, which is a play on a very popular auto detailing show called, I think it was Pump Your Ride, but very involved consumer education engagement. So the graphic up there is a sample of the website that they ran. So not only did they have to promote the program, but there was a huge amount of interaction with our industry on what happens to your car once it enters the system. What's the responsible thing to do? And that was sort of our ability to also engage with a lot of different people. But ultimately, they had ad campaigns, contests, a lot of social media activity, just a lot of different consumer-oriented activity to try and promote the program. And we got pulled along in that as the program evolved. As I said, part of that education engagement was about auto recycling. To the federal government's credit, they knew that by intervening in the marketplace, they were going to be disruptive. And they posed the question of, why are we, if we intervene in the marketplace to reduce emissions, are we creating other problems that we need to deal with? And as they scanned the environment and looked at the legislative and regulatory oversight of our industry, they deemed that it wasn't up to the standards to make sure that every vehicle coming off the road through their program was managed properly. So they contracted us to develop the Canadian Auto Recyclers Environmental Code, CAREC. So this was a standards book, voluntary, because it only related to auto recyclers who are participating in Retire Your Ride. But what it did was it began to codify what their legislative requirements are across Canada, but also brought in a lot of best practices, housekeeping, things that the industry knew should happen in order to manage it properly. They provided funding to train all of the auto recyclers who wanted to be involved in Retire Your Ride to that code. And most importantly, they hired and trained third-party auditors who would visit every single auto recycler who was on the program and audit them against a protocol, a scoring system, if you will, that made sure that they were meeting the legislative requirements and then being graded on a percentage scale as to how well they were meeting the best practices, the housekeeping, the industry knowledge that we had created. And here's an example of the website, which still exists. And it has got the audit protocols, it's got videos that were used as part of the training process, a lot of explanation materials as to for an auto recycler to use, for consumers to better understand what modern auto recycling is all about. As we get near the end, and I'm sort of out of my presentation mode, I'll make sure that I paste in to the chat box a series of resources that talks about Retire Ride. It provides the links to Carrick and some of the other items. So Carrick is still very much alive and working for us. And as I said up front, all of our members continue to be audited against Carrick. And it's what really defines who we are, how we're different. And so we've been 10 years now since the um, Retire Right ended, but it's still utilized by the association for what our members are about. So in terms of some of the legacies of the Retire Ride program, Carrick is front and center with that. And the government will even admit that, yeah, that was one of our best wins. Removing these vehicles, is good for short-term emissions, but ultimately they wanted to make sure that they were kind of leading the industry to where they needed to be. We still have the certified network of auto recyclers. Again, it's mainly the ARC members. You can be audited if you're not a member, and more um, other entities are looking at Carrick. So after Retire Ride ended, we ended up on 3 separate occasions working directly with the manufacturers, both Ford and GM, for dealer incentive programs. So GM ran a cash for clunkers program, which we processed all of their vehicles. Ford ran a Recycle Your Ride program on a number of occasions, and we processed all of their vehicles. And we even generated contracts with a couple of the other OEMs on some of their vehicle take-back programs or recall programs. They looked at Carrick and said, yes, this is what we need to make sure that all of those vehicles are managed responsibly. Since Retire Ride, 6 of the provinces, and there are 10 out there in Canada, have updated their regulations for what auto recycling should be. And basically encoding a lot of what Carrick is into regulations and legislation. Many of the provinces could not use Carrick directly because it hasn't gone through a process like the Canadian Standards Association, but it is directional, and it approved that little recyclers in remote locations could meet Carrick, run a better business, and be compliant with the rules. One of our provinces has actually identified Carrick specifically. They already had an auto recycling license, and they adopted Carrick as the standard in order to obtain, and now this year to maintain that actual physical license enforced by the province. At the end of Retire Right, ARC inherited all of the assets of the program. So we are now the owners of Carrick and responsible for updating it and deploying it. We inherited all of the branding, the database that ran the system, the network, the URLs, everything that Retire Ride was all about. And we continue to operate Retire Ride and its sister vehicle donation program called Car Heaven on a national basis. So they operate as tangible things that we can interact with the public because it's branded, it's got good awareness, and more than one person has said, this Retire Ride is great. Finally they're recycling vehicles properly. And we always tell them, we've been recycling vehicles for 100 years now in Canada. This is just something that you can latch onto and understand better. One of the things that, so as I talked about, this was a program as opposed to a policy. And Canada really does not have an end-of-life vehicle policy as to how it wants to handle things. But at the end of Retire Ride, we worked with the Clean Air Foundation, now called Summerhill Impact. and the Government of Canada. And we ran a 2-day innovative forum on the future of auto recycling in Canada. The manufacturers were represented. We had delegates from Japan, from the Netherlands, from the USA. Really, the complete supply chain was there to talk about what are the gaps, what are the opportunities, and that led to things like a white paper on auto recycling, which we were able to deploy, and that's what started this whole process of how do we um, take all the good things that came out of that program and make sure that every vehicle is handled in that fashion. And that led to provinces, territories, the federal government sort of recognizing the auto recycling sector. And because we were part and parcel, we as the association were part and parcel of the development, deployment, and wrap up, we got pulled along very well. So making sure that we kind of brought all those stakeholders together was really important to making sure that it lived on. So some lessons learned. Certainly, excuse me, this is Retire Ride was an opportunity for the industry to coalesce around the issue. Up until then, because there weren't a lot of federal activities, the industry kind of operated somewhat independently. But because they saw money coming in, they saw programs coming in, they really rallied around and said, let's, make sure that we grab this, we benefit as much as possible. The second was the professionalization of the industry. So again, having standards, even if they're just ours, but having them audited third party, it's really easy to point to that from a government perspective, from a media perspective, from a local community engagement. This is what we are, this is what we represent. We want everyone to operate to that level. A lot of members looked at the Carrick and said, why should I adopt this? I've been doing this for 50 years. Why doesn't the guy down the street do this? But we convinced them that you need to show leadership. You need to do this and, show that this can be done and done profitably. And virtually to a T, all of our members who went through Carrick and who continue to go through it comment that they wish they had done this 20 years ago, because ultimately it's about running a clean, crisp, organized, systematic approach to auto recycling. So all of them are more profitable, they're cleaner, safer, they have better insurance. So insurance companies now recognize Carrick and offer better insurance. So it is really been the driving force in professionalizing the industry. It certainly allowed us more interaction with the OEMs. So we meet regularly. I'm meeting with them next week to talk about stewardship of electric vehicle batteries. And we've had hundreds and hundreds of meetings and interactions, educating the OEMs on what we do, what our problems are, how the things that they do impact us. And they're infinitely more bigger than us. They're more professional than us, but they understand that we need to be healthy for their business to be healthy, because we do not have direct EPR, extended producer responsibility, for vehicles in Canada. But we do have a managed system, and we're trying to figure out, what's the best way for us to be healthy and for them to be healthy, and stakeholder to everything related to ELV. So we've raised our profile such that when the government or anybody is looking at, what's going on in the end of life vehicle, whether it's selling parts, buying cars, processing the vehicles, they're turning to us, and we're having input into those dialogues. And again, electrification, is one of the biggest interactions. It's going to dramatically change the industry. People who are selling EVs, people who want to recycle the batteries, they're finally understanding that those batteries, those components need to be removed from the vehicle before crushing and shredding. And that's the best way to obtain those resources before they're lost, and just good for the overall economy. Other lessons learned, and I said this up front about how Environment Canada approached this, is don't solve one problem like emissions or greenhouse gas reductions and create another problem like abandoned vehicles or improper dismantling and pollution. So it draws some lines in the sand and creates a legal framework and earlier discussion about the formal and informal markets in India, in Canada. It is, we want it to be black and white because we have laws, we have rules, and that provides a business who's or individual who's operating illegally in the marketplace at least a path forward and understanding what the requirements are in order to be part of the regulated community. But we are still kind of tightening the noose on allowing those to operate. And ultimately, we want the balance of removing vehicles from the road and the industry's need to actually survive. So those older vehicles are a source of parts. They're a source of for us to sell to kind of keep them on the road. Um, and so where there is discussion about scrappage, our position is that they need to have modest financial incentives. Throwing $5,000 on an old scrap car is going to completely disrupt the industry. We're not a fan of any limit on part restrictions. You can't sell the engine or you can't sell any items off of this vehicle. It really guts the existing industry. And ultimately, our final goal is to encourage proper ELV recycling for all vehicles. So don't just focus on vehicles that go through a program. Make sure that you're looking at and measuring all of the vehicles that are coming off the road. There's 1.6 million, and Carrick has shown that a legitimate business doing the basics can run a better business and protect the environment and participate in the overall economy of making sure all those vehicles are handled properly. So that's the end of my formal presentation.